morning, if you have your New Testaments, be opening up to Romans chapter 9. Romans chapter 9, I've asked Brother Ken to lead us in the opening prayer, and then after that, Brother Ron Williams will read for us the text that we have before us this morning. It's a little bit of a lengthy reading, Romans 9:14 through the end of the chapter, but it is what we have before us this morning. Brother Ken.
Our Lord, most gracious Heavenly Father, we're so thankful that we have an opportunity this morning to assemble together like this, study a lesson from thy holy and divine word. We pray, Heavenly Father, that each of us as listeners will accept those things that are said and when we get to the word, and if they've been found true, to apply them to ourselves so that we may be better Christians in the future. We pray, Heavenly Father, that everything that we do and say here this morning is study and worship to you will be pleasing to you. In Christ's name we pray.
Thank you. Romans 9:14. What shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whomever I will have compassion. So then it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. For the scripture says to the Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. Therefore he has mercy on whom he wills, and whom he wills he hardens. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who has resisted his will? But indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? Does not the potter have power over the clay, from the same lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? What if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory? Even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles, as he says also in Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who were not beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called the sons of the living God. Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. And as Isaiah said before, unless the Lord of Sabbath had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom, and we would have been made like Gomorrah. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone, and as is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whoever believes on him will not be put to shame.
I appreciate that so much. We began this section of the book of Romans 2 weeks ago. Of course, we were not interrupted, but still yet we've had a week prior to this. We had a week break because of our gospel meeting. So while we jump back into Romans chapter 9, we need to test the waters again. You know, Romans chapter 9, it's when I was a kid, when we'd go over to my neighborhood or my neighbor's pool, the best way to to get in a pool is you gotta jump into it sometimes. And that's fine and good, but at the same time, I'm a sane human being, and I really love those zero entry pools that you see a lot of places now, where you can just gradually go into the pool before you get accustomed to the water temperature and the temperature outside. And that's really what I want us to do again this morning, is I would much rather us just gradually make our way into the context versus just falling head over into it, because I think that could drown us, because it drowns me. And I've struggled more over these passages than any other passage. And it's not that I'm struggling to understand the concepts. It's just trying to keep everything in the right manner and keeping everything lined up as it should be, so that, of course, I'm not finding fault or seeing something or saying something that would be untrue. When we think about what Paul does in Romans chapters 9 through 11, he asked a question all the way back in chapter 3 and verse 3, and here's the question. If some did not believe, their unbelief did not nullify or will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it? And of course, in the context of Romans chapter 3, it's the faithfulness of God in respect to the unfaithfulness of Israel. Israel had failed to believe, but their unbelief does not nullify the faithfulness of God. And that's what Paul really does in Romans 9, 10, and 11, is he presents to us the faithfulness of God. Even when Israel rejects God, God still is able to carry out his predetermined plan to bring salvation to mankind. And that's really what Paul's doing right here in the midst of Romans chapter 9. He's showing us how it is that God has been able to do this and bringing about all of this despite Israel's unbelief and disobedience. Now, at the beginning of chapter 9, we take note that Paul had what type of desire for his Jewish brethren? He desires their salvation for them. And we talked at length, about that idea that, Paul says, let me be accounted as accursed for their salvation. And really, that's the imitation of Christ there. Greater love has no man than to do what? Lay down his life for his friends. What is Paul willing to do in verse 3? He's willing to lay everything down on the line for the salvation of his friends. That's an imitation of Christ that we see in Paul there. In verses 4 and 5, we see Israel's blessings God's blessings of Israel, and throughout their history, God has been with them, God has protected them, God has providentially cared for them. And ultimately, the reason God's always done this for Israel and with Israel is because of what? What is God always doing when he's preserving Israel? He's fulfilling those promises, specifically going back to Abraham, right? That promise of the seed is what drives the Bible. That promise that there would be a pure line of ancestry that would take us all the way from Adam to Joseph and Mary, who then bring forth Jesus. That purity, that pure bloodline is what God is always doing in his protecting and providing for Israel. Now, Abraham's seed came through the promised son, which is Isaac, not the son of man's own desire, Ishmael. And the same could be seen there with Jacob and Esau. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But then we come to verse 14, and there's another Jewish objection. The unbelieving Jew retorts of God's choice. Essentially, that's what they're saying. Well, if God has chosen Isaac over Ishmael, if God has chosen Jacob over Esau, God is unrighteous. Well, is there any unrighteousness with God? Certainly not. May it never be. God forbid. That does not compute. So at the very outset, again, what is Paul's presentation of God? God is always what? He is always righteous. Even when you and I cannot comprehend nor understand God's righteousness, Does that nullify God's righteousness? No. Our unbelief, our incapable of understanding all that He's doing, that does not nullify who God is. God is always righteous. God is always just. And I think there's something else. There's a third quality of God that is really called into question in this section of Romans chapter 9, and that's God's holiness. And we'll talk about that in just a few more moments. But when we think about Paul's response, the question is there any unrighteousness? Well, God forbid. May it never be. That's not so. God is just. And that takes us back to something that Paul's already discussed and relayed to us in Romans chapter 3, that God is the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Romans 3 and verse 26. God is just. Well, then we come to this exciting section in the quotation, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. I need somebody to help me. What are we talking about? What is it that Paul's relaying to us here that helps us understand the righteousness of God?
He's the potter.
He's the what?
He has all the power and all the authority. We have no authority to question the one who has all authority.
All right, so he has all the authority, he has the right, and really that's where Paul uses three different examples. He uses the example of Ishmael and Isaac, Jacob and Esau, and now Moses and Pharaoh. He uses those three examples to really motivate us and bring us to what he ultimately says with the clay and the pot, or the pot and the molder. Yes, Brother Frank.
You mentioned this section deals with the righteousness of God. Ron took it in a little different direction, in the direction that I would take it in, and that is the sovereignty of God.
Yes.
That He can do what He wants to do because He is God.
Mm-hmm.
And the next verse, verse 16, so then it is not of Him who wills. So what is the it? I think the it's God's choice.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get to affect God's choice because God is the sovereign God. He makes the decision.
Absolutely. And you can think about that in a variety of ways. I think about Sodom and Gomorrah a little bit later in the text in verse 29. Sodom and Gomorrah. Did Abraham change the outcome for Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 18? Now, if the righteous had been found, would God relent? Yes. And does God have that authority? Why did Jonah get so mad with God in Jonah chapter 4? Because you showed mercy and you showed compassion. And Jonah became angry with God because of that. So this isn't some new mindset. No, when we think about God's sovereignty is going to be accomplished despite what man may attempt to do to thwart that sovereignty's choice.
Jonah didn't like God's choice.
Yes,
Because God's choice didn't line up with His choice.
absolutely.
That's what He did when He would choose.
And that's the same thing in Romans chapter 9. They hate the fact that the inclusion of the Gentiles. And Paul's trying to get them to realize this isn't something new. This shouldn't have shocked you when God does this. Now, when we think about the heart of Pharaoh and God, and I know that anytime we journey through that section of Exodus chapter 4, all the way through that story and that narrative, there's multiple times we look at the heart of Pharaoh. But I do want us to take note that the majority of times it may say that the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. But there's also instances where Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And there's also other instances where it's more generic, and I do believe that it tends to lean that it was Pharaoh who hardened his own heart. So who hardened Pharaoh's heart?
God.
God.
God. Because Pharaoh was created for that time and that place to help. God made him, as He does all,
Mm-hmm.
to accomplish His will. We are born at a particular time and place that God chooses, and He uses us to accomplish His will. We are made that way. I believe this.
Well, I'm thinking of Jeremiah 29 and verse 11. It may be a tie-in to what you were saying. Brother Man, you were going to say something.
Man's part is harder than when he refuses to do what God wants him to do.
And I think that so God's will is going to be accomplished whether I harden my heart or I soften my heart, right? Again, God's will. So what we have to take into focus here too is let us not drive down a railroad tie, a spike, and say that we're talking about eternal destinies here. Because we're not talking about eternal destinies in Romans chapter 9. What we're talking about in Romans chapter 9 is God's sovereign will. God's sovereign will is going to be accomplished despite what man does in response to God's sovereign will. We're not spiking eternal destiny here. And that's one of the distinctions that I want us to make, because that's the distinction that the Calvinists don't make in this context. They use this context to absolutely prove that God individually predestines individuals either to be hardened or to be softened. That's not the context here. It's that God's will is going to be accomplished despite what man may will or what man may attempt. There in that verse 18, or verse 16. It does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs. There's nothing that man can do to disrupt God's sovereign will. And I think that's a distinction that we need to make at this outset.
And tying in the word predestination, going back to chapter 8, he uses that term, I think, to make this point. Verse 29, "Whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." That's God's predestination. He predetermines that we should be like his Son.
Be like his Son. And again, how man responds to that predetermined plan is not been made by God himself. It is entirely dependent upon man. Yes, sir.
Yeah, predestination is they don't understand what you're talking about, obviously, when they drive that peg you're talking about. But verse 17 says exactly what it says. What it says is, God made Pharaoh, like Ed was saying, for this purpose. He made Judas also for a purpose. He made Satan also for a purpose.
For a purpose.
For a purpose.
I'm sorry, Ed. Who did you?
What purpose?
Pilate. Yes.
Pilate, for a purpose. What that doesn't mean is that he also made us without free will. He's on all of these cases. Satan himself fell from heaven. Why did he fall from heaven? He rebelled against God. He made that choice. He was still created by God, and he still serves a purpose today in our lives, and that is to separate us from God. God made him because he gave us free will. We couldn't have free will if God did not make Satan. We would not have free will. We would be predestined, except for Satan being created to give us a choice. But Satan made that choice. It was still his choice that he became that. And Pharaoh also had the choice. Like you said, Pharaoh hardened his own heart at times. That means when he did that, he was making a choice.
Well, and here's the dilemma that I face. You know, when we're having these discussions, there's so many terms that are said that I'm just like, it's semantics of just letting the Bible say what the Bible says at times is the most difficult, because we understand how those biblical terms have been used in illegitimate manners.
But we can't understand it correctly if we get carried away with all this false doctrine.
Well, absolutely. But I mean, when we think about when God says this, for this purpose to Pharaoh, did God not say that to Nebuchadnezzar? Did God not say that to all of the foreign nations who came against Israel and against Judah? He said, for this purpose. I mean, so Pharaoh's not a choice that stands alone. Like it never happened before and it never happened again. No, God has always used others to bring about his plan, even when those others may, from our appearances, look unholy. I mean, what's the whole book of Habakkuk about? Why, God, did you choose the Babylonians to destroy Judah? Because from Habakkuk's point of view, he could not comprehend how the godless Babylonians were given the power to destroy the God of Israel. But, of course, God's answer to Habakkuk was what? Y'all aren't so innocent. Y'all are guilty of sin, and that's why I'm bringing this judgment against you.
Instead of destroy, I'll take judge.
Well, it's the same thing, though. But it's the same thing, because he destroyed them through the Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, he absolutely decimates Jerusalem. And you go to where Isaiah prophesied, though there is the sand of the seashore, there is only but a remnant that is going to return. You think about 603,550, 601,730 are the first two censuses. How many return in Ezra chapter 2 or 3? I think it was 60,000. You think about that. Millions, only a remnant return. So God's will is going to be accomplished. Now, when we think about, this whole idea of God predetermines individuals and stuff like that, I don't want to spend too much more time because there's so many more questions we got to get to. But one of the things that I was thinking about, and when a man's heart is open and desiring God, what does God always do for that individual? Specifically in the book of Acts. If their heart is open and desiring God, what does God do? He gives them a path to find them. In Acts 8, the Ethiopian eunuch's heart was open, and what did God do? He sent Philip. In Acts chapter 10, Cornelius' heart was open, and what did God do? Sent Peter. In Acts chapter 17, Lydia, the Philippian jailer, and all those others had an open heart, and what did God do? He called Paul by the Macedonian call. Acts 18, Paul's wanting to leave Corinth, but what did God tell Paul? I have much people in this city. God makes a way for those who are earnestly seeking him. And that's the point that I want us to see there in this context. Yes, sir.
You've already hit on this, but I think this further proves that God is God when he uses both good and evil people to accomplish his will.
Absolutely.
That shows he is God. Because what would we do as humans? Who would we use?
Absolutely. We're only going to use the
We
good.
would want people that would do it our way, right?
Mhm.
I mean, they would agree with us and all that, but God uses people, and that's totally unlike what we as humans do. To me, brother, proves that he's God.
Absolutely. His ability to pull this thread and pull all of these pieces together, only the sovereignty of God is able to accomplish that.
Prior to going to Philippi, Paul had planned to go in a different direction.
Absolutely. He was going to stay in Asia.
And we go this way.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have to move. List two things God accomplished through Pharaoh of Egypt. For this purpose, what are two things God accomplished? He raised him up. Miss Julia, you said, showed his power. Showed his power. And then because he showed his power, what's the second? His name was spread throughout all the earth. When the two spies were taken into Rahab's house, where did Rahab begin to tell the spies? She knew what was going on. Why? Because we've heard about what your God did to Pharaoh in Egypt. She began there. So at the conclusion of the narrative in Exodus. And when Israel exoduses from Egypt, it's not just Israel who knows about this. The whole world knows about this. Another thing that I thought of there in connection, well, it may be a little bit later that I have these notes, but I also know it's here. In 2 Chronicles chapter 17 and verse 10, in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verses 29 and 30. At the beginning and end of Jehoshaphat's reign, the dread of the Lord was over the people because God fought against Israel's enemies, or Judah's enemies. The dread of the Lord, the name of the Lord has great power. All right, well, what should man never say to God? Why did you make me like this? Now, what is it that the Jewish objector, again, you go back to verse 14, the Jewish objector says, well, there's unrighteousness in God. No, God has the capability, He has the full right, power, and authority to choose whom He chooses. Well, then verse 19 is, well, then how then does He find me at fault when I cannot resist His will? How can I be blamed for what God has created me to achieve, and I can do nothing different? So that's the dilemma that now the Jewish objector is bringing up. But what must we understand? And y'all have already talked about this. Brother Ron, you said this back when you were looking at all of those different examples. Every single one of those examples, Pilate, Judas, Pharaoh, all of those individuals still had, at the end of the day, what? They had a choice. They had free will choice. God put the breadcrumbs out there, and it was their choice to either partake of them or to reject them. And I don't remember where I stole this question from. You know, the better question that could have been asked by the objectors, or really the response that Paul could have given, is, here you're asking, well, why am I still being held guilty? Instead of asking, why am I not willing to submit and to be shaped like God? Because that's the problem here. The Jews were unwilling by obedience of faith to be shaped into the image of the Son, Romans 8. And that's the dilemma. It's not God's will that has been, it's not God who has failed. It's Israel who's the failure. All right, and I know I'm moving quickly, and I know this is deep, and we're dropping the plumb line this morning, but still yet we got to move through. The second, the potter and the clay. Who was the first to use this illustration talking to Israel? Isaiah and Jeremiah. Isaiah would have been the first. Now, you turn back with me to Isaiah chapter 29, where it's used. Because it's right there in the midst of a section that we know very well. Or at least the reason we know it is because it's quoted in the New Testament. Isaiah 29 and verse 16. Look at what the Lord says through Isaiah to Israel. He says, you turn things around. Shall the potter be considered as equal with the clay? That which is made says to the maker, he did not make me. Or what is formed say to him who formed it, he has no understanding. So, what was the accusation that Isaiah brought to Israel? You've got things backwards. You're thinking that you have the right, because you're God's chosen people, that you've been blessed throughout all the generations to bring about. You have the right then to say to God, why have you made me this way? Again, they've turned everything. Now, if you drop back in that same context, back to verse 13, the Lord said, because this people draw near with their words and honor me with their lip service, but they remove their hearts far from me, and their reverence for me consists of tradition learned by rote. Do we know that verse from anywhere? Jesus used that, and he used it again to diagnose who? The Jews. You give me lip service, but your heart is what? Far from me. Who chose to have their heart far from me? The individual, the Jew did. The one who was being molded was saying to the molder, why have you made me this way?
I referenced Isaiah 64:8.
All right, 64:8.
Clay in your power.
Absolutely. And then, of course, the larger one that probably draws most attention is Jeremiah 18. In Jeremiah 18, Jeremiah is called by the Lord to go down to the potter's home. And when he arrives there, how many of you have ever done anything with clay? You've done something, pottery, at least my sister-in-law, I think she took like 3 years worth of pottery classes at Mississippi State when she was there, primarily because she liked doing that. It was art, and it was something. And I've got one little piece of pottery at the house that I actually made in Starkville one Saturday night after a football game. Her and I and some other friends went to and it's worthless. It's a common use. It's definitely not honorable use. But we understand that, right? You see that potter, they're shaping whatever it is that they're creating, and then they're shaping it, but their pinky gets off just a little bit, and they take off a little bit too much on one side, and what do? They stop the wheel, and then they crumble it all back up, and pour a little bit more water back on it, and then begin to reshape it. And if they mess up again, and then they begin to reshape it, and all of that, and that's really, that's what Jeremiah sees when he goes into the potter's house, and God says, do I not have the right? I'm the one who brought you out of nothing. I'm the one who took you out of Egypt, and I am the one who has been crafting you, molding you. But yet, when you continue to despite me and disbelieve me and not obey me, of course, you will pay the penalty of that. Now, when we think about the vessels of wrath, in verses 21, 22, 23, the vessels of wrath and the vessels of honor, again, we can allow outside influences in on the Bible and saying, well, here again, God's saying that He's made some to be wrath and some to be honorable. Is that what God is saying? Is that what Paul's arguing? No. I don't see that. If God made some to be elect and some to be non-elect, what did Romans 2 and verse 11 say? And if He made some elect and some non-elect, God would have to be what? He would have to be a respecter of persons. It violates its own self there. God cannot be Romans 2 and verse 11 and then be something completely else in Romans chapter 9. That's the way I look at it. Turn with me to 2 Timothy chapter 2. The Bible is its own best commentary. And I think 2 Timothy chapter 2 gives us a better understanding, or at least helps me understand some idea of what Paul is trying to teach in Romans chapter 9. I want to read verses 20 and 21. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 20 and 21. Now in a large house there are not only gold and silver vessels, but also vessels of wood and earthenware, and some to honor and some to dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from these things, he will be a vessel of honor, sanctified, useful to the master, prepared for every good work. Now, what's the emphasis in those two verses?
Could it be actually changing oneself to please God?
Absolutely.
We have a choice regardless of what we do. We have an opportunity to change our lives and to become faithful to God.
So that vessel that once was a common vessel could become a vessel of honor if he so chooses. And I think that same attitude can be found here. And this is where Mr. Bird kind of surprised me in his literal, or as he was trying to give a applicational interpretation of this passage. He says, consider this analogy. Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump of clay a beautiful vase to decorate the house and a chamber pot to relieve oneself in? Of course he does. Think of it this way. What if God, desiring to show his righteous anger and to make his saving power known to all, had given the chamber pot every chance to graduate into the living room vase, but the chamber pot chose to remain a chamber pot? And I thought, Brother Don, I was reading that and I was like, that's exactly what I believe Paul's saying here. God has given Israel every opportunity and chance to change and to become the vase, but they chose to remain a chamber pot. Now, of course, he continues on. He says, is God still right to smash the chamber pot when it gets too smelly? God has the right. And I really appreciate it because that helped me again. It was a different analogy, a different way to phrase the analogy that helped me understand it a little bit better. Yes, sir.
Had one of my teachers when I was back in high school put it this way, and it wasn't biblical. But a lot of the guys at school did Skull or Copenhagen or whatever, they would take their Mountain Dew bottle after they got finished with it and then start spitting. And so that Mountain Dew bottle actually carried, I love Mountain Dew.
Mm-hmm.
But once they spit it, there's no way I would take it. So it's kind of a similar concept. It's what the user put in it.
Absolutely.
And defiled.
Absolutely. That's a very good, that's a modern day application. I think that analogy is a good analogy. I think that helps us understand what Paul's talking about here. All right. Well, let's push through these final few questions. When we come to the book of Hosea, who had always been a part of God's plan in the scheme of redemption? The Gentiles. Now, we just got done reading through Hosea this past week, and as I journeyed through Hosea, of course, I remember that Hosea is a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel, and it's during that period right before Israel's going to be taken into Assyrian captivity. Hosea was commanded to do what in chapter 1? Marry a woman of harlotry. And then Hosea had 3 children with that woman. Now, we could talk another time about those 3 children and whether or not those 3 children were all from their union. I do believe that it definitely distinguishes, or it becomes hard for me to see it when we get to that 3rd Loami. But that 3rd child is what? You're not my people, but those who are not my people, I will be my people. From Hosea's point of view, he would have probably understood what he was saying is that even though God is sending Israel into Assyrian captivity, God will do what? God's going to call Israel back. But Paul adds almost a double fulfillment. God's not just sending Israel and talking about Israel here. God's always also talking about who? Well, Jesus, but the Gentiles. He's going to bring the Gentiles in. Those who are undesirable, those who are ignored, forgotten, those are the ones God is going to bring in. Again, Isaiah chapter 10, verses 22 and 23, the quotation from Isaiah there, and then the idea of Sodom and Gomorrah, that if God had not had mercy, God would have completely decimated Israel, Judah. But to fulfill his promises, to fulfill what he had promised, God kept a remnant always. Any comments or questions down through verse 29? Now, when the readers, I mean, you try to put yourself in their position. They're battling with Paul, especially his Jewish audience. They're trying to understand how it is that God is still faithful, that God is not unrighteous, because here the inclusion of the Gentiles just goes against the fray. It's not what they expected at all. But Paul says, did you not read your Sunday school material? Did you not read what you've been taught all your life? This is what God's always been prepared. And that is the inclusion of the Gentiles. Yes, sir.
Okay, it's easy to overlook the power of God, verse 29. He talks about the Lord of Sabaoth, Sabbath, Sabaoth. And that's the Lord of hosts, the Lord of the armies of heaven. And it's hard for us to begin to imagine what the armies of heaven would be like if one angel could kill, what was it, 600,000?
185. Yeah, 100. Yeah.
And there's so many references in the Old Testament that the one in particular is when Joshua becomes the leader of the people,
Mm-hmm.
and the Lord appears to him
Joshua 5.
in Joshua
Mhm.
5. And he asked him who he was before he against me, and he says, I am the Lord of hosts.
Mm-hmm.
The word Sabaoth was not used in the Testament.
That's the.
And that's an example of God appearing to man, which is called a theophany. There are a number of theophanies mentioned in the Bible, but that one sticks out.
Absolutely. And I always remember Elisha prays that the man's eyes be opened, and what did he see? He saw the mountainsides were full of angels. That is who is for us. That is who is on our side. And again, that takes us back to Romans 8, does it not? I mean, Paul has not left what he has stated in Romans 8. Well, what had the Gentiles attained that Israel failed to? Righteousness according to faith. According to faith. And really, this is where there's almost, chapter breaks are put there by man. That, it's really, verse 30 ties in so well to the beginning of chapter 10. Because it's a contrast. There's a righteousness that is attained by faith, but in chapter 10, they're still trying to attain it by the righteousness of law. And that's the contrast here. The Gentiles had attained it by faith. And I think about Acts 13. In verse 44, Paul came to them the next Sabbath. He begins to preach to them the gospel. And how many people showed up? A lot of people showed up. The whole city turned out. And when the Jews saw the numbers, they became envious, began to blaspheme the gospel of Jesus. And Paul said what? You've judged yourself. I'm now turning to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles heard this and they rejoiced greatly. What did the Jews continue to do? Persecute Paul and persecute the Christians. So everything that we're talking about in Romans chapter 9, that's the Jewish mindset that Paul is having to battle against. And then why had Israel not attained it? They pursued it by a law of righteousness. And they did not pursue it by faith. Again, we spent multiple weeks early on in the book of Romans. Where does perfect obedience, or where was their attempt to perfect obedience get them? Can a man observe all the law? No. And if you fail one time, you've lost it. And that's the idea here again. Israel tried to pursue without faith, and ultimately they stumbled over the stumbling block. Who is the stumbling block and rock of offense? Jesus. It always centers and it always comes back to who he is and all that he is for us and even them. We preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles foolishness. There is never, nor will there ever be, disappointment in Jesus. One last quotation. Jason Horton said, Jesus Christ is the chosen and precious cornerstone of God's entire plan of mankind's redemption, Whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. To trust in our family heritage, physical circumcision, the record of our own works, or anything else is to turn our backs on our only hope. There is salvation in no one else. I appreciate so much your kind attention. I hope that the discussion has been edifying to you as it was for me. Romans chapter 10, next week, those questions are there on the